may have heard me talk about launching the DB task force at Investment Conference. We've launched that task force, and that task force has been busying away, working away, and has today published the interim report, its interim report. So I'm delighted that Ashok Gupta, who has chaired the task force, is here to talk us through the task force findings and its key analysis. We're then going to be joined by our panel, who I'll introduce in a moment, who will respond to what Ashok has said and give us their thoughts about what we need to be doing to fix DB. But Ashok, first of all, over to you, and we'll scooch up so there's room for everyone to.
Good morning. I'm delighted to be here today to launch the interim report of the DB Task Force. What precisely is the challenge facing the DB sector? Well, we've spent 6 months discussing, analysing, and researching exactly that. And it's been quite an insightful journey for me and my fellow task force members. But I'd particularly like to thank everybody who supported our work, either by responding to the call for evidence, by meeting with me and my fellow task force members, or merely just getting in contact and giving us their views. And it's clear we've struck a chord, and a thorough review of the DB sector is, if anything, well overdue. We've looked at the sector from a number of perspectives. How well does the system work? How well does it meet the needs of employers? Is it able to exploit capital markets to best advantage? But above all, how well does it serve the needs of the millions of people who depend on DB for their financial security over the next decades? And lest we forget, DB is still an enormous force for huge social and economic good. And it matters enormously today and will continue to matter for decades to come. It matters to the members. It matters to the 4 million members who'll benefit from, who are getting DB pensions today, just as it matters to the 20 million people who expect to get pensions, DB pensions, over the next decades. And most of these people aren't rich, and they're not going to receive huge amounts, £7,000 on average. But that £7,000 could be the difference between a retirement just above the breadline or some hard-earned comfort in their later years. And DB is a big provider, it's a key provider to capital markets, and through capital markets to the UK economy. The sector invests £1.5 trillion, a figure that's doubled over the last decade. It owns 80% of the UK index-linked gilt market. It's a big owner of UK infrastructure, a growing owner of UK infrastructure, and wants to own more. And a well-functioning DB sector is a crucial driver for all parts of the UK economy. DB also matters to employers who have chosen to provide DB schemes and who continue to support them. Last year, employers put £31 billion into DB schemes. That's 9 times the amount they put into DC schemes. They injected £350 billion over the last decade. And nearly a third of the contributions made last year were made to make good deficits. Yet despite these massive amounts, deficits just keep getting bigger. Employers are having to run really hard just to stand still. So the task force has concluded that DB is not working as it should. The sector has problems. Not problems that you can understand just by looking at deficit numbers, big and scary and wildly fluctuating as they may be. We believe you have to start from what really matters, the risk to members' benefits. So that's what we set out to do. And to do that, we used an integrated risk management model called Mousetrap, which brings together asset risk, liability risk, and employer insolvency risk all in one place. So we could understand how the health of employers interacts with the health of pension schemes to impact the likelihood of members being paid their benefits in full. We then set that understanding against the views of members through some market research that we did over the summer. Because while scheme members may recognize there's a risk to benefits if you work for Tata Steel or BHS or Bernard Matthews, they don't recognize that there's a risk to their own benefits. So we applied this model across schemes in each of the regulator's 4 covenant groups. And if you take schemes with the strongest employers, which the regulator deems as strong, which represent just under a quarter of all liabilities, 23%, these schemes pose little risk. Only about 6% of these schemes are expected to default over the next 30 years. If you take the next group, which the regulator deems as having covenants which are tending to strong, and these are just over a quarter of liabilities, 27%, here the risk is higher. And 20% of these schemes are expected to default over the next 30 years. And then you take the next 2 groups, which the regulator describes as weak or tending to weak. Here the risk is much greater. 65% of schemes with covenants deemed as weak and 40% of schemes with covenants deemed as tending to weak are expected to default over the next 30 years. So let me put this another way. If you take the last 2 groups, which represent 50% of all liabilities, these schemes have a 50-50 likelihood of getting to solvency before the sponsor falls over. So the risk is much greater than is generally understood. And if you take a lower for longer scenario, where you have sustained low interest rates, the risk is even higher, which is why the PPF is such an integral part of the landscape. It does an invaluable job in paying benefits to 200,000 members and providing reassurance to millions of others. But we need to be realistic as to how much risk the PPF actually takes off the table. If you take account of the cap, the 10% haircut for actives and deferreds, and the wage between CPI and RPI benefits, in aggregate, the PPF leaves members bearing around 20% of the risk. And members' understanding of this is very low. Let me describe some of the results from our market research. 71% of members believe their benefits are guaranteed. Under half had ever considered whether a deficit could impact their benefits. But once members understand that they do bear risk, they are keen to understand that risk better and to understand how it relates to the health of the company. Employers, they're running hard just to manage DB scheme risk and to manage the impact of DB schemes on their businesses. And DB schemes are a significant consumer of corporate capital. 11 billion just to make good deficits last year, 8 billion in the first half of this year. Now, this isn't money that employers choose to pay to provide better benefits to their staff. It's money they have to pay to make good historic promises. A typical scheme has only 16% active members. The rest are either retired or ex-employees. And it's money that can only be spent once. So if it's spent on pensions, it then can't be spent on wages. Wages which in real terms have flatlined for the bulk of the economy over the last decade. It's money that then can't be spent on contributions to DC pensions. It's money that then can't be spent on much needed investment in business growth. And yes, it's money that can't then be spent on dividends. Dividends that would support the employer's financial viability and provide a source of income to pension schemes in general. So it's very clear that employers are struggling to manage the impact of DB schemes on their businesses. And it's no surprise that employers have chosen to close so many schemes to future accrual. But it's not just the contributions that cause pain. It's the volatility of deficits. And it's the impact of this volatility on the corporate's financial results. And it's the desire by employers to reduce volatility that encourages them to seek matching of assets and liabilities and take investment risk off the table. That's a pretty hefty nudge from the people who are paying the bills, even at the cost of increasing the bills. And it's a nudge that's reinforced by several other de-risking nudges from a belief that it's what the regulator wants. It's what other schemes are doing, or it's what my consultant is advising. But when you model the aggregate impact of schemes taking less investment risk, it does nothing to reduce risk to members' benefits. If you take less investment risk, you lock in the deficit, you bake in longer recovery periods, you assume greater amounts of employer insolvency risk before the benefits are secured. And the end result is you take less investment risk and you have more covenant risk. In aggregate, we've just moved risk around. The right answer for each scheme clearly depends on a proper consideration of risk, benefit risk, covenant risk, investment risk, in the context of that individual scheme. And all of this is happening across 6,000 schemes. 6,000 schemes with 6,000 sponsors. And a handful, and they're all each trying to manage the risk to members and the drag on sponsoring employers. And a handful of these schemes have the scale that we see in other DB economies like Canada and Holland. But we then have hundreds of smaller ones and thousands of very small ones. So many that it's inevitable that we have wildly divergent standards of governance. Few schemes are able to capitalize on economies of scale. Few schemes are really able to bargain effectively with suppliers. And this matters. It matters because academic research has shown that improved governance can be worth 1% of the fund's value each year. And that great governance can lead to outperformance of benchmarks of 2% plus per annum. The Dutch have demonstrated that investment costs are a function of scale. For a tenfold increase in funds, you get an 8 basis point reduction in fees, in cost. And closer to home, the LGPS Central Group, by bringing together 9 pension schemes across the Midlands, is anticipating 200 million of cost savings from consolidation over the next 15 years. And these 6,000 schemes all invest through and with the help of an extensive chain of intermediaries. lawyers, accountants, actuaries, asset managers, investment consultants, custodians, covenant advisors, etc. Each with a profit to make, and as the FCA has concluded, often with limited alignment of interests with the scheme, with their clients. We have a messy system. Too many people trying to run too many schemes with the help of too many intermediaries. And that fragmentation has set the tone for the regulatory system we've wrapped around it all. A regulatory system that rightly focuses on member protection, but of necessity regulates to the lowest common denominator, that substitutes micromanagement for the proper exercise of discretion by trustees, sponsors, and advisors. And all of this adds to the volume of regulation that schemes have to manage. 850 new pieces of regulation and legislation over the last 2 decades. And it forces schemes into the position of binary outcomes. You're either funded and on a path to providing full benefits and being fully funded, or you're heading for the PPF. So there's no safety valve. There's no middle road, no landing in this relatively large space between full benefits and PPF benefits. A landing place that, in practice, could do a lot to reduce risk to members' benefits. We need to do better. And in listening to views over the last 6 months, we keep coming across 4 recurring themes, 4 areas where we could do better. And these 4 areas will form the foundation of the Taskforce work over the next 6 months. First, the system is too fragmented, and we need to investigate the scope for consolidation to understand how a smaller number of better governed schemes can deliver better value for members and sponsors with lower risk. Secondly, scheme resolution is too inflexible. So we need to understand how we can open the door to innovation and flexibility to reduce the pressures of sponsors under and mitigate risk better. Thirdly, there's too much risk, there's too much rigidity in scheme design, in benefit design. So we need to understand how a more flexible approach can ensure that risks and costs are shared better across members and between generations. And finally, we need to manage risk better. There are clear inefficiencies in sponsor capital allocation. Schemes are capable of bearing more investment risk. And more importantly, there's too little attention paid to the most important risk of all. So we need to build a greater focus around risk to members' benefits. The task force is determined to improve the health of the DB sector, to enable it to be the force for social and economic good that we know it can be, to reduce risk to members' benefits, to improve capital allocation across the economy, and to free employers to allocate their scarce capital resources more efficiently. And we need to do so now. The cost of inaction is just too great. As schemes hurtle towards maturity, the opportunity to make a meaningful difference is fast diminishing. So our work starts today with the publication of our interim report. And we will continue with the same rigorous focus on evidence and openness to a diversity of views that's characterized the first phase. We'll publish our final report in March next year at the PLSA conference. But between now and then, I hope I can continue to rely on the support of everybody in today's audience as we seek to identify solutions and build consensus around the need for change. Thank you.